verses 24 and 25. And I'm going to read that before I begin my presentation. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. This is where we get the phrase, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And of course, Abraham Lincoln quoted it during the Civil War, that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that this union, the United States of America and the Confederate States of America, need to be one country. And of course, bubbling under that strife, that war that claimed more lives than any other war in America's history, the Civil War, was the issue of slavery and the issue of white supremacy. And what's happened is a myth has surrounded the issue of slavery and this history in America. Now, of course, there's a myth in it in the South. There's a lost cause theory. There's people who argue that it wasn't really about slavery, it's about states' rights and all of that. But there's a myth in the North. And the myth that was created by the North is that the issue of slavery is a Southern phenomenon. It's not a Northern phenomenon. And that the North are the heroes on this issue, and the South are the villains. That's the Northern creation. After the Civil War ended, the North wrote itself as the heroes. And so many of us grew up thinking that slavery was a Southern thing and the North didn't have that. And if you have delved into this history since then, you know that that's not true. The North had slavery. When America was 13 colonies, all of the colonies had slavery. So yes, Virginia had it, but Massachusetts had slavery. New York had slavery. Vermont had slavery. Delaware had slavery. And so slavery was a national phenomenon. Similarly, when we talk about Jim Crow, segregation, we have told or been taught a myth that the civil rights movement aimed at the South was fighting Jim Crow, which was a Southern phenomenon. But what you ought to know is that America was a Jim Crow nation, and that the South was not the only perpetrators of this form of white supremacy. And so what I'm going to talk about today is Detroit's history in that period that we know as Jim Crow. On some level, we still exist in a level of segregation. And so on some level, we have two Detroits right now. We have a Detroit that has many resources. It's being developed. It has businesses. It has assistance from taxpayers' money to build stadiums. And then you have another Detroit where you have homes that are blighted, streets that only have one house left on it, people, hundreds of thousands of people whose water has been shut off, people who lost their homes through illegal tax foreclosures. So you even still have two Detroits. So I'm going to talk about that historical narrative that hopefully it'll shed some light to where we are right now. So Detroit, of course, is not the name that the indigenous people gave when they were settled here. And they had a number of names, but the most well-known name is Wawiatunong, which is the crooked way. And of course, they're talking about the strait, the waterway, because the settlements of the Anishinaabe and the other indigenous people are at the river. When the French arrived in 1701 to build a fort near that river, Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. And so Antoine de la Motte de Cadillac and the other French who arrived with him helped build this fort so that they can have a fur trade with the Native Americans, with the indigenous people. And while they're building it, they named it Fort Pontchartrain because, of course, Count Pontchartrain paid for this expedition. You know, there's a long history of naming stuff after the people who paid for it. And so right now, we have a convention center that sits basically where Fort Pontchartrain used to sit. And it's named after one of the most racist mayors in Detroit's history, Albert Cole. And it's going to be renamed now because Chemical Bank has paid for the naming rights. And so it's going to be, we're going to remove the segregationist mayor, Albert Cobo's name, from this convention center. But we're going to put in the name of a company that's paying for those naming rights. It'll be called TCF Convention Center because Chemical Bank is merging with TCF Bank. Not sure if we're moving forward with that. But this history, of course, I call it, so there's this idea in sociology, which was one of my majors when I was in college, this idea called conspicuous consumption. And that is when everybody, all classes do it. Working class people, poor people, and of course wealthy people buy stuff to show off, to show that, hey, I'm not poor. So poor people do it at a higher rate than any other group of people, but people do it. So of course wealthy people buy big homes, they buy boats and yachts. It's a level of prestige to show how wealthy they are. They buy sports cars. And middle class people do it. They buy a brand new refrigerator, or they buy the washing machine that picks up the clothes by itself. You know? And poor people do it too. They may buy a polo shirt. And if they buy a polo shirt, they want that polo symbol right there. If they buy Calvin Klein jeans, they want to show that that's Calvin Klein on those pants. They don't want the kind that you can't tell what the name is. And so all people practice this conspicuous consumption. But there's another idea that I think that we ought to understand, and that's conspicuous compassion. When people give money so that their name can be on it, and their name can be attached to what they gave. So that's why we have we're going to have a TCF convention center. That's why we have a Mike Ilitch School of Business. That's why we have a Kid Rock Music Lab at the Detroit Historical Museum. Because these wealthy people want their name on anything that they give. It's conspicuous compassion. And we need to talk a lot about that as well. So now, let me return to what I'm really supposed to be talking about, and that's Jim Crow, segregation. What you need to understand is that segregation began in the North, not the South. And we've been taught this myth that segregation, Jim Crow, was a Southern phenomenon, and that the lunch counters that didn't serve African Americans, black people had to go to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. You had white and colored signs at the water fountains and at the restrooms in the South. We call that Jim Crow, and we make it a Southern phenomenon. But Jim Crow was all over the nation, and Detroit had its own version of Jim Crow. And the North starts it because the northern cities and states begin to end slavery before the southern parts of the United States. And when they end slavery, they don't end it in practice equality. They end it in practice inequality, segregation, Jim Crow. The South learns it from the North. After the 13th Amendment is passed, after the Civil War ends, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, the 13th Amendment makes slavery unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment says that African Americans are now citizens. The 15th Amendment says that black men have the right to vote. The Southern leaders don't want to practice this form of equality. They don't want to enforce the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. And so they look to the North, and they say, hey, we've been enslaving black people down here. We haven't been treating them equally. We don't think you have either, North. What have you been doing? We were enslaving them down here, but what have you been doing, Boston? And Boston says to Mississippi, well, we don't let them go to school with us. Oh, that's what you do? Oh, and of course, we made it illegal to teach any slave to read and write, so we didn't have separate schools. It was illegal for them to even have school, but we like your idea. And the South adopts separate schools. They learned that from the North. Philadelphia, hey, what have you been doing with black people? We've been enslaving them down here. What have you been doing? And Philadelphia says, certain jobs we don't allow them to have. We bar them from certain kind of employment. Oh, that's what you do? Oh, you know what? That's a good idea. And the South starts practicing that. Hey, Detroit, what have you been doing? We've been enslaving these people. What have you been doing, Detroit? Oh, we don't let them live in the same neighborhoods as us. The South learned segregation from the North, right? And so black people have been living in the city of Detroit since the period of slavery and the Underground Railroad. And as they're coming, particularly during the Underground Railroad period, they're building institutions. And of course, they're going to build their first institution, Second Baptist Church, the oldest African-American church in the state of Michigan. Is founded as a faith place for African Americans, but it's also a freedom center for African Americans. Faith and freedom for black people in the 1800s is the same place and the same people. So if you're looking for where are the people at and where are the institutions that are helping African Americans against slavery in the 1800s, look at the churches, because that's where they are. They're faith and freedom. And they're also education centers. And in 1850, the Richards family leaves Virginia and comes to the city of Detroit. They join Second Baptist Church. They have a little girl in the Richards family. She's 10 years old. Her name is Fanny. And Fanny is a member of that church. Now, she comes from, for the African-American community, a wealthy family. And she's had an education up till she's 10 years old. When her family joins Second Baptist Church, she continues her education there. By the time she's a teenager, she's a teacher at the school inside of Second Baptist Church. Let's be clear, Second Baptist Church is the first school for African Americans in the city of Detroit as well. Because when Detroit Public Schools was founded in 1842, black people cannot go. And so, black people start their own schools inside of the churches, and Second Baptist is the first. By the time she's a teenager, Fanny is a teacher at that school. After the Civil War, Detroit Public Schools says, you know what? We should let Negroes go to school. And they open up the first school for African Americans. The name of the school is Colored School. So let's be clear, we're talking about Jim Crow. And we're not talking about the 1950s. We're talking about the 1800s now. And Detroit is practicing Jim Crow before the South has figured that stuff out. And so African Americans are going to colored school. At least if they're going to public school, they're going to colored school. Fanny Richards applies for a job at colored school and gets hired. By the time she's hired, they open up the second one. And so she works at colored school number 2. When she's there, by that time, she's studied all over the world. And when she goes into that school, she's clear on the fact that this school is unequal. It doesn't have books, don't have paper, don't have pencils, don't have notebooks, doesn't have a blackboard, chalk, desks, chairs, none of that. None of the stuff that all of the public schools for whites have. And she leads us a lawsuit to overturn segregation in Detroit Public Schools in 1869. The Michigan Supreme Court rules in 1869 that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. And she begins teaching at the first integrated school in Detroit, Everett Elementary, in 1871. This is almost 80 years before Brown versus Board of Education. Right here in the city of Detroit. She's living in the lower east side of the city of Detroit, in an area that you probably know as Black Bottom, which used to be a community, which of course was destroyed through the works of Edward Jeffries, one of the mayors of the city of Detroit, and the city council at that time, and Albert Cole, the following mayor of the city of Detroit. But at the time that she's living there, it's an integrated neighborhood. African Americans have been living there since slavery and the Underground Railroad, but immigrants have moved there. People from Germany have moved there. So you have German immigrants there. On St. Antoine and Congress, Isaac and Sarah Cousins, their home sits right there on that corner. Isaac and Sarah Cousins are German immigrants, and they're Jewish. And they're going to start the first Jewish synagogue in Michigan's history, Temple Bethel, in their home. After the Civil War, members of Bethel are going to leave and build and start their church across the street, buying a former African-American church, St. Matthew's Episcopal. They're going to buy the first St. Matthew's Episcopal, and this group of Jewish parishioners are going to start the second synagogue in the state of Michigan, Shari Zedek. So right there in Black Bottom, you have African-Americans and you have German immigrants, some of whom are Jewish. But you have other German immigrants, some of whom are Catholic. So on Monroe and St. Antoine is St. Mary's Catholic Church. It's older than everything in Greektown, even though it's in Greektown, because Germans were living there before Greek immigrants came. And so that's St. Mary's. It still sits there. Down the street from it is the oldest African-American church, Second Baptist. It's also older than anything else in Greektown. Again, African-Americans were living in what is Greektown before it was a Greektown. It was part of Black Bottom. Because Black Bottom was named that because of the soil. The French called it Fond Noir because of its rich soil. And from that we get Black Bottom. And so you have all of these immigrant groups. Just go up on Gratiot. You got two churches, St. Joseph's Catholic Church, which is getting its steeple repaired right now. And it's a German Catholic church, been there since the 1800s. That's Black Bottom. A block away from it is St. John's and St. Luke's, old Lutheran church, a German Lutheran church. Across the street from it is Historic Trinity Lutheran Church, another German Lutheran church. That's for the wealthy Germans. The wealthy Germans don't want to go to church with the working class Germans, so they build their church across the street. So historic Trinity Lutheran, that's the upper class, and the St. John's is the working class folk. But all of these people are living alongside African Americans. And you can see the history if you just pay attention. Annunciation, Greek Orthodox Church is on Lafayette and Hastings. Lafayette in 75, 375 now. And that congregation founded in 1910 when Greek immigrants are coming into that area. Go down the street and you'll see historic Our Family Trinity Catholic Church, the Italian Catholic Church. Again, all of these immigrant groups are living alongside African Americans, and those are Fannie Richards' students when she works at the first integrated school in the city of Detroit. The Italians, Germans, Jewish people, Irish people, Greeks, all of these Polish people, and of course African Americans. Those are her students. She's not going to live long enough to see what's going to happen in the decade after her death. The decade after her death, all of those immigrant groups who were discriminated against when they came to America. They were economically discriminated against. They couldn't afford to live wherever they wanted to in the city of Detroit, and they were forced into the Lower East Side. They also were discriminated against because there was an anti-immigrant mood in America at that time. And so they were trying to, people thought they were going to steal their jobs, and they didn't like these immigrants. Many of them spoke with an accent, or they didn't speak English at all. And so because of that, they could be identified as immigrants. Many of them were Catholic or Jewish, and so that they could be identified by their religion as being an immigrant. But their children, and especially their grandchildren, will gradually be treated as white Americans. They'll be able, if they have the economic ability, to move out of black body. African Americans, whether they have the economic ability or not, are largely cordoned in this Lower East Side. There were always exceptions. There were African Americans who got out, but this is the largest concentration of African Americans in the city of Detroit, in the Lower East Side, the neighborhood that will be known as Black Bottom. And so by a decade after Fannie Richards is dead, that neighborhood is almost all black. And we got segregation in the schools all over again. But it's not school segregation that the schools are segregated by. It's housing segregation. Because where you live is where you go to school. And since African Americans live largely in Black Bottom, the schools that they attend are largely in or very close to Black Bottom, while whites can go to schools all over the city of Detroit. And so you have segregation, Jim Crow, all over again. And then Dr. Asher Sweet is going to come here to the city of Detroit, this medical doctor, during the same time period when hundreds of thousands of people are leaving the South. We call that period the Great Migration. And people are leaving the South, going to places like Cleveland, Chicago, Harlem, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Detroit. They come into Detroit because during World War I, there's a push for factories to bring in new workers. But also, Henry Ford is offering $5 a day to all workers. And so African Americans are coming to the city of Detroit during this time period. And Henry Ford is a proponent, a supporter of segregation. On one end, he needs these African American workers. And so he's bringing them in, he's helping to get them here. But when they get here, he's segregating them in the plants, where they can only work in the grinding and sanding and in the foundries. And he's helping to develop little towns like Inkster, so that African Americans can live away from white workers, but live close enough to get to work. Right? And so this is what's happening. You have institution builders who are behind segregation. And Dr. Asher Sweet defends his home because of a racial restrictive housing covenant and a mob outside of his home. He defends his home against this mob and wins this lawsuit, or wins the case. He's being charged with first-degree murder. But of course, his life is not going to be the same. He loses his wife, he loses his daughter, he loses his brother, and then we lose Dr. Asher Sweet to suicide. And so, by the time we get to the 30s, the federal government has joined in to the Jim Crow Act and has created a federal housing plan that they will subsidize the homes and mortgages for people, white people, and not subsidize the mortgages for African Americans, even though economically they're the same. In places like Detroit, where they're both working at the factories, they're both making about the same amount of money, but one group of people is going to be assisted by the government to buy homes. Another group of people, what are they going to get? the ability to move into the Brewster projects. And so they're going to be able to pay rent at the Brewsters, not building any equity. And a large part of the inequality in wealth in America today, and in Detroit right now, is based on those home loans from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when African Americans were disallowed, where the federal government